In the heart of West Africa, under a searing sun and skies thick with dust, something extraordinary stirred in the red soil of Burkina Faso. Not the thunder of tanks nor the speeches of ministers, but the hum of 10 million bees. While the world looked elsewhere, President Ibrahim Traoré made a gamble so unconventional it shocked allies and enemies alike. He released an army of pollinators across the land. Why? Because something precious was dying, and with it, the future of a nation. Crops were failing. Mango trees no longer bloomed, cotton bolls withered before opening, and millet yields shrank. But the true enemy wasn't drought or poor soil. It was silence. The bees were gone. And without them, Burkina Faso faced a slow collapse into hunger, aid dependency, and foreign control. But instead of signing contracts or begging donors, Traoré chose resistance. Not with weapons, but with wings. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It's the future our elders prayed for. Subscribe and stand with us for an Africa that will never bow again. For centuries, the farmers of Burkina Faso have worked the earth with patience, pulling life from arid soil under relentless sun. From millet to maize, from cotton to groundnuts, the land gave until it no longer could. In recent years, the harvest waned, not because of drought alone, nor from exhausted land. The change was deeper, more sinister, and nearly invisible. The bees were gone. What began as a subtle shift soon became a crisis. Mango trees no longer bore fruit. Cashew orchards stood still. Vegetable gardens withered despite water. The hum once heard beneath every tree, the ancient music of bees, vanished. Older farmers told stories of how, in their youth, bees buzzed like choirs. Now there was only silence, and with silence came hunger. Scientists raised alarms. This was not merely an environmental issue, but a civilizational threat. Pollinators were disappearing across the globe. But in Burkina Faso, the impact was immediate and brutal. The Ministry of Agriculture reported staggering declines, up to 40% crop loss in some provinces, a spike in child malnutrition, and entire villages abandoning farming as the earth gave no return. The causes were many. Pesticides, cheaply imported and heavily marketed by foreign agro-firms, devastated insect populations. Urban expansion consumed wild habitats. Climate shifts disrupted ecosystems. But the result was singular. Burkina Faso stood on the brink of food collapse. President Ibrahim Traoré saw this not just as a biological crisis, but as a direct assault on sovereignty. He knew hunger breeds dependency, and dependency, subjugation. If Burkina Faso could not feed itself, it would again fall into the orbit of foreign powers, receiving aid under terms dictated by distant capitals. In Traoré's mind, food was freedom, and the vanishing bees were stealing both. His cabinet proposed familiar remedies, imported hybrid seeds, contracts with Western agri-corporations, synthetic fertilizers. But he refused. Every contract, he warned, is another chain. He would not trade one form of captivity for another, dressed in the garb of assistance. Then came the idea, radical, improbable, almost mythical. Traoré proposed to breed and release 10 million bees across the nation. Not in labs or greenhouses, but into the wild. A return of the pollinators. A return of balance. His inner circle balked. What if it failed? What if it caused panic? What if it backfired? But the president saw something deeper. He saw in the bee a metaphor. Small, vulnerable alone, but powerful in community. Builders, sustainers, silent warriors. If Burkina Faso became a sanctuary for bees, it might just save its crops and its independence. Plans began in secrecy. Breeding centers were built in the Kawander Basin, with local scientists trained in ecology and entomology. International allies like Cuba and Brazil quietly offered technical advice. But this was not to be a foreign-led initiative. It would be Africa-led, Burkina-born, sovereign to its soul. The announcement came not in a quiet press release, but in a thunderous speech in Ouagadougou. Before a sea of citizens, Traoré declared, "We will not feed our children with imported contracts. We will feed them with life. 10 million bees will rise, not against man, but against hunger. Let the world watch." And the world did, stunned, divided, dismissive. But would the bees bring salvation or sting a nation into chaos? The day the first wave of bees was released across the Burkina Faso countryside was like no other in the nation's modern history. It was not marked by military parade or foreign delegates, but by something far older, far wilder. A soft, low hum filled the air. From helicopters, from trucks, from crates carried by hand, swarms of bees were released into fields, forests, and villages. In the Central Plateau, Farmers paused their plowing to watch the skies ripple with movement. Children stood on tiptoe, pointing at the golden clouds drifting like incense smoke across the horizon. Old men wept quietly, recalling a time when every mango season was heralded by the buzzing choir of pollinators. Now, after decades of absence, the sound had returned. But this was not just an environmental operation. It was political theater, deliberate and potent. President Ibrahim Traoré wanted the world to witness something unforgettable, a nation reclaiming life, not with weapons or foreign deals, but with wings and instinct. He called it the first ecological mobilization of a sovereign state. Reactions came swiftly, and they split the nation. In rural areas, there was cautious optimism. Villagers instinctively understood that where bees flew, food followed. They remembered how trees bore fruit when the air buzzed, how cotton once bloomed without chemical intervention. Some communities even broke into spontaneous celebration. Songs, drums, prayers offered to ancestors, asking them to guide this new generation of nature's soldiers. Women's cooperatives gathered, hopeful for honey to sell, wax to harvest, crops to flourish. To them, this was not madness, it was memory being restored. Yet in the cities, especially among the elite in Ouagadougou, the release was met with ridicule. Academics and politicians accused Traoré of grandstanding. Journalists scoffed, calling it populist theater and scientific naivety. One commentator on a French radio station mocked, "Bees won't feed a nation, they will sting it." International media were equally divided. Western headlines screamed, "Burkina Faso gambles its future on bees," "Pollinators over policy," "Third world leader chooses insects over industry." Some labeled Traoré a madman, others a visionary. But the president was prepared. In a nationally televised address the night of the release, standing beneath a massive wooden carving of a hive, he looked straight into the camera and said, "The West arms itself with bombs and dictates. We arm ourselves with bees and dignity. These bees will not sting our enemies, they will shame them. Because they will prove what no one believed, that Africa can feed itself, defend itself, and restore itself with its own hands." His words struck deep, especially among the youth. For them, Traoré was more than a president. He was a rebuke to every narrative of African helplessness. His defiance, his poetry, his audacity, they mirrored the aspirations of a generation tired of being told what could not be done. Around Africa, the story caught fire. Social media exploded with images of hives painted in national colors. Hashtags like Washer Bee Sovereignty and Africa Rising trended in Mali, Niger, even Kenya and Tanzania. Artists drew murals of bees lifting baskets of millet. Musicians composed anthems for the buzzing army. Environmentalists, long sidelined in African policy circles, found themselves at the center of national discourse. Traoré's move forced even skeptics to debate ecology, not as a Western import, but as a sovereign priority. Still, the fears were not unfounded. Some villagers reported swarms near homes. A child in Yako was hospitalized after stings. Cattle were spooked in the north. Rumors spread. Some whispered the bees carried Western diseases. Others claimed they were drones disguised as insects. Fear mingled with awe. To counter this, the government mobilized medical teams, trained veterinary units, and established hotlines. Every case was addressed publicly. Traoré knew transparency was the only antidote to fear. He visited affected areas personally, calming crowds, reaffirming his message. The bees are not a burden, they are a beginning. We are not returning to the past. We are planting the future. Despite the noise, the deeper narrative was taking hold. One not about insects, but about dignity. The bees were symbols of return, of refusal, of rebellion. Was this theater or the first act of a revolution? Within 6 months of the bee release, whispers began to circulate. Not in policy rooms or foreign embassies, but in the soil, the stalls, and the kitchens of ordinary Burkina Faso homes. Something had changed. Trees that once stood barren now bore fruit. Gardens once gray with dust now shimmered with green. And in the markets of Ouahigouya and Banfora, jars of honey, golden, thick, and fragrant, began appearing on tables. The first signs of the gamble's success came not from official reports, but from the people themselves. Mango farmers in the east reported trees so heavy with fruit they needed extra hands to harvest. Women tending vegetable plots found tomatoes fuller, okra juicier, and aubergines rich in color. Cotton fields that had suffered for years began to show blossoms in abundance. Then came the data. Agricultural inspectors confirmed what villagers already knew in their bones. Crop yields had risen by over 30% in key regions. Malnutrition rates began to fall. Rural schools reported higher attendance as children no longer needed to walk miles in search of food. The country had not just avoided collapse, it was beginning to bloom. But numbers alone could not capture the shift. The most profound transformation was psychological. For decades, rural communities had been fed the lie that survival was only possible through foreign aid, genetically modified seeds, or Western charity. Now they held jars of honey and sacks of millet born of their own soil, thanks to their own bees. They tasted for the first time in years sovereignty. Cooperatives sprang up like wildflowers. Entire villages formed pollination guilds, sharing knowledge, building hives, managing bee colonies. Women, long excluded from cash crop economies, became central figures in the honey trade. Young men who once considered migration now stayed home to farm. Honey, once a luxury, became currency, traded, consumed, exported. Traoré seized the momentum. In his speeches, he began referring to the initiative not just as an environmental success, but as an act of political defiance. The West gives us bread with one hand, he declared at a rally in Bobo-Dioulasso, and takes our future with the other. We no longer need to beg. We have our bees. We have our bread. The opposition struggled. How could they criticize a project that was visibly transforming the nation? Even those who had once mocked the initiative now found themselves silenced by the applause of the people. International NGOs that had called the plan reckless now offered funding for community hive projects. Irony had turned to imitation, but challenges remained. Isolated bee attacks in certain provinces caused panic. Urban elites still derided the program as romantic nonsense. Foreign-backed media outlets spread rumors. Some claimed the bees were genetically engineered. Others said they were infected with foreign pathogens. Traoré responded with the same clarity he had shown from the start: transparency. Monthly ecological reports were published. Independent scientists were invited to observe the hives. Medical teams were deployed swiftly wherever incidents occurred. Traoré's government didn't deny the problems. They owned them, solved them, and let the people see. Beyond ecology, the bees began to transform politics. Rural infrastructure, roads, clinics, water systems, were financed by honey taxes. New schools bore plaques reading, "Built with bee revenue." Children learned about pollination in science class and sang songs about bees in assembly. The nation had a new rhythm, and it hummed like a hive. But Traoré understood that this was about more than farming. It was about identity, about reclaiming a future not built on dependency but dignity. In a national address marking the anniversary of the initiative, he said, "Our ancestors planted with the moon, harvested with song, and thanked the bees for their bounty. Today we have not invented something new. We have remembered who we are." He called it the Burkina Faso bee revolution. And he was right. It was a revolution, not of fire but of flight, not of slogans but of soil. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. But could honey replace bullets in a nation still under siege? As news of Burkina Faso's bee revolution spread beyond its borders, reactions across the globe ranged from cautious curiosity to open hostility. In the capitals of the global north, Paris, Brussels, Washington, diplomats scrambled to make sense of what many had dismissed as a stunt. Yet the results were undeniable. Crop yields were up, honey exports were flowing, the people were visibly empowered. And all of it had occurred outside the orbit of Western aid. Western think tanks published reports warning of ecological populism and unsupervised biointervention. European trade officials began murmuring about restricting African honey exports on the basis of quality control and compliance standards. The irony was not lost on many. After decades of dumping substandard fertilizers and pesticides across Africa, the West now pretended concern over purity. In Washington, some policymakers feared that the real danger wasn't bees, it was the narrative. Here was a Sahelian nation, long dependent on donor packages and military assistance, achieving food security through its own initiative. What if others followed? What if this ecological uprising became political? Whispers of sanctions surfaced. There were suggestions to cut development aid, to isolate Traoré diplomatically, but each threat only fueled his defiance. In a fiery speech before the National Assembly, he declared, "They called our bees madness. Then they called them miracles. Now they fear them because these bees carry not just pollen, but the idea of independence." Elsewhere in the world, however, admiration bloomed. In Latin America, environmental movements from Brazil to Bolivia praised Traoré's ecological boldness. Agroecologists from Cuba offered support, recalling similar successes under embargo. Across Africa, the story struck a deep chord, particularly in nations like Mali, Niger, and Guinea, which had also begun rejecting Western dominance. Malian Prime Minister Adama Maiga hailed the initiative as a template for sovereign agriculture. Niger's leadership proposed a Sahel pollinator corridor, a regional ecological alliance to restore biodiversity through native bees. From Tanzania to Senegal, leaders began exploring their own pollination programs, openly crediting Traoré for the spark. This quiet continental alignment, outside Western institutions, beyond donor diktats, was what truly unsettled the traditional powers. For the first time in decades, Africa was not asking permission, it was setting the agenda. Traoré called this moment hive diplomacy, not built on treaties but on trust, not enforced through soldiers but through seeds and bees. He invited African leaders to Ouagadougou to tour the hives, to taste the honey, and to imagine a different kind of development, rooted in nature, sovereignty, and pride. Could bees become the next front in Africa's war for independence? As the second year of the bee initiative unfolded, what began as a daring gamble now revealed itself as a model, one that rippled beyond Burkina Faso's borders and began to shape the future of an entire continent. It was no longer just about saving crops. It had become a roadmap for how Africa might reclaim its agency in a world that so often denied it. President Ibrahim Traoré, once seen as a rogue outlier, was now quietly guiding a coalition of Sahel nations who saw in his audacity a new way forward. Mali and Niger joined hands with Burkina Faso to launch the Sahel Pollinator Corridor, a transnational ecological belt spanning thousands of kilometers, where pollinators would be restored, protected, and integrated into agricultural policy. Guinea expressed interest. Chad followed. Tanzania and Uganda began consultations. What tied them together was not just environmental concern, it was the hunger for dignity. These nations recognized that if Burkina Faso could restore life to barren lands without debt, without conditional aid, without external diktats, then so could they. They saw that bees were not merely insects, but instruments of sovereignty. Through them, African nations could generate wealth, foster community, preserve ecosystems, and build industries, all without foreign intermediaries. And so the idea spread, not by decree but by example. But challenges remain. Sustaining the momentum will require vigilance. The honey markets must be protected from exploitation. Local cooperatives must remain transparent and fair. The ecological balance must be managed carefully to avoid unintended disruptions. Education must be deepened so that the next generation sees bees not with fear, but with reverence. Yet above all, Africa must decide, will this be a passing miracle or the first chapter of a continental rebirth? Traoré has made his choice clear. At a Pan-African summit, he declared, "A single bee cannot make honey, but a hive can feed a village." Africa must become that hive. Not a continent of beggars, but of builders. Not recipients, but producers. He urged his peers to reimagine sovereignty not as military posturing, but as ecological ownership. Not just about borders, but about soil, seed, sky, and the right to shape one's destiny. And so as hives continue to buzz across the Sahel, and as farmers harvest both fruit and pride, one truth becomes clear. The bees were never just about Burkina Faso. They were the spark for something larger. The hum is growing louder. Will it echo across the continent? In a world where headlines are too often filled with war, poverty, and desperation, the story of the Burkina Faso bee revolution offers something rare, a glimpse of sovereignty not as theory, but as action. The quiet hum of bees has become the pulse of a new national rhythm, one built not on debt or dependency, but on resilience, ingenuity, and dignity. Across Burkina Faso, the evidence is everywhere. Honey cooperatives empower women. School children study pollinators with pride. Markets bustle with jars of made in Burkina Faso sweetness. Clinics, roads, and solar farms carry plaques reading, "Financed by the bee." What once sounded impossible now tastes tangible. What once was dismissed as madness now fuels transformation. But perhaps the greatest victory is not economic or agricultural, it is psychological. For generations, Africans were told they could not thrive without handouts. Traoré's gamble shattered that myth. He proved that, with courage, knowledge, and unity, even a nation battered by climate and geopolitics could rise. The message is spreading. Mali, Niger, Guinea, and beyond. All now look to the hive not just for honey but for hope. And it is this wave of belief, this revival of possibility, that may yet reshape the continent's destiny. If the Burkina Faso bee revolution taught us anything, it is that sovereignty is not granted, it is grown. And in the fields of West Africa, tended by the hands of ordinary people and pollinated by wings small but mighty, a new future is blossoming. If this tale stirred your soul, do not scroll. Like, share, and subscribe. Because Africa's voice is rising and every buzz counts. Leave a word below if you believe in this journey. Africa knew, honey is sovereignty, or simply, we make honey now. Because in the hum of 10 million bees, a continent is rewriting its story. And Ibrahim Traoré's sovereignty is not a slogan, but a song. And the chorus, Burkina Faso bee revolution. Burkina Faso bee revolution.